Thanks for sitting down with us. Understand you're a busy man, so sort of we'll go straight into it. But what do you think are the challenges facing New Zealand at the moment?
Well, Astrid, firstly, it's good to be with you. Look, I think there's quite a few challenges facing New Zealand. There's also some tremendous opportunities that we have before us as well. Fundamentally, the big issue that we have is how do we actually generate an economy that creates higher incomes for people so they actually get to have more choices about how they live their lives. I think there's a lot of work for us to do in improving and building a world-class education system as well here in New Zealand. It's interesting that our standards have slipped relative to other countries over recent years, and I think we really need to redouble our efforts and make it a world-class education system and even better than it is today. And I think there's also a lot of work to do around improving our infrastructure. You know, we see it here in this part of the country, in the Hawke's Bay, where there's very reliant on some key roads to be able to get to places, and it's really important we've got really modern infrastructure that enables people to live here but be able to connect to New Zealand and to the world as a result as well. So there's quite a lot of things that we've got to do. We've got to keep working really hard on some of the inequality we see in New Zealand as well, and actually thinking about how we can creatively solve those problems. There's a lot of work, I think, in mental health in particular as an area that we really need to be thinking about some new solutions and some new plans for as well.
And obviously sort of front and centre of most people's minds is COVID and the response to that. Like, how would you do that differently?
Well, look, I think, what I'd say up front is I think the government handled it fairly well in 2020. I'd just say the last year I thought was a real shambles, and we sort of lost the opportunity and all the good work that we'd done in 2020. And I don't mean that to be political at all. It's just more about a reality of, we've been talking about rapid antigen testing and having that available in many countries. You can just buy them in supermarkets, but they've been there hasn't been something the government's been pushing very hard. Certainly we had a very slow vaccination rollout. I spent a lot of time in Auckland in lockdown as an Auckland-based person, and that was really a function because we had a very slow rollout at the beginning there. And now it's really about making sure we get things ready, so as we deal with Omicron, that we're making sure that we have all the defences and all the risk mitigants that we need in place. So things like ICU beds, New South Wales has actually doubled, I think even tripled its ICU bed capacity over the last 18 months. We haven't been able to improve that. We do need these rapid antigen tests in place. We do need to encourage people to get boosted quickly. We need to be able to offer parents choice for vaccinations for their kids as soon as we possibly can. So it's just making sure that we are executing these things well. We often can talk about them, but actually making sure it's happening on the ground, and that's really what we've got to do.
And opening the border?
Well, look, I think, at the moment we really need to be able to get through, to where we are at the end of February, and then ultimately, yes, we need to open it up, because I think the reality is that Omicron is coming, whether we like it or not. It's going to be very endemic in our society, and ultimately we need to work out how we can manage that risk. We've been advocating very strongly that we can manage people from different countries and different risk countries and be able to bring them back home to New Zealand. For example, when you think about the number of New Zealanders that are overseas that might be living in Queensland, that might be double vax, in many cases now triple vax, which is probably what we really all need to do with Omicron. Why can't they come home in a risk managed way, in the same way that an Aucklander can now travel to Christchurch or Queenstown? So I think we ultimately have to acknowledge we've got to start opening the country up. We need to do that intelligently, not recklessly, but ultimately managing the risk that sits there.
Okay, and in terms of the Hawke's Bay tourism industry has been hit hard, what would National do to help them?
Well, look, I think tourism and hospitality have been the two industries that have been strategically the most challenged, and it's been a very, very difficult time for them. I obviously came from the tourism industry beforehand as the CEO of Air New Zealand, and a big part of my focus was making sure we could build out tourism across the whole breadth of New Zealand. And so really I think it's an industry that does need more assistance, more help. I'm really worried that this coming year, by the time we actually open borders properly, it could be a big part of the year through, and people are just hanging in there, if hanging in there at all, and we really need to be able to offer them, I think, some additional support.
And another one is the growers. Like, growers particularly on Hawke's Bay are still struggling and with not enough labourers because of COVID.
Yeah, and I think that's a real challenge. I've got a meeting actually after this one with the growers in this region, and we're going to have a sit down and a catch up properly about what their issues actually are and what they're seeing. But the common theme very clearly is there's massive skills and staff shortages as a result. You're right, that's a function of the border. But we're living in a country at the moment where we also have a low level of of unemployment, almost full employment. We have a very constrained economy where you've got supply chain constraints, you've got staffing shortages and constraints, but we also have an awful amount of people still on welfare that we need to be able to say, if we can't move them from welfare into work now, when and how can we do that? Because that's really what we want to do. We want to be able to encourage vulnerable people who have been doing it really tough to be able to find a pathway to work, so they've actually got their future secured for themselves and their family. And so we've got to be able to think about how we use talent within New Zealand. But yes, you're right, we've ultimately got to be able to bring people in from outside that have the skills that we need. We are 10,000 IT workers short, we are 950 nurses short, we're 250 doctors short. It doesn't. We know we've had problems in growing with RSE workers, and even despite attempts to manage and de-risk it, we still can't get the government to understand that. And I think we need to listen to those things very carefully.
And talking about, you sort of met with the mayors and people in Hawke's Bay this morning. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I actually think it's always very useful when a central government politician meets with a local government politician, because the two ideally should be working together to make the improvements that are necessary to people's daily lives in a given region. And so what's been pretty special about this area is that you are very blessed that you've got 4 mayors, and with the regional council as well, that are actually wanting to work and partner together more so than I see anywhere else across New Zealand. And our particular conversation this morning was around the Three Waters, which is a reform program by the government to take actually the water assets that have been paid for and owned by ratepayers and put them into 4 big mega entities, and take them away from the councils and put them into these big bureaucratic entities. We're against that for a number of reasons, but actually what was really important was that the Hawke's Bay 5 councils have all come together with a very coherent solution that they're proposing to the government, which I actually think is a very good answer for what we need to see across the rest of New Zealand as well. And so, it's about how do we help them actually to be able to get the government to really listen to their proposal, because actually they've got a great idea on where the assets can stay in local control, but they actually get some of the scale benefits by coming together and pooling, working together as 5 councils. So so it's just really good to see that in this region the mayors are all elevated to think not just about their own particular patches or districts, but actually to think about the broader region. And I think that makes it much easier for central government to be able to deal with all the mayors, because they're all singing off the same song sheet, and can work out how we can work together to get things done.
And because we're sitting in Havelock North, which is essentially ground zero for all the water reforms. So going forward, would you sort of push that model with Hawke's Bay? Yeah,
well, I think where we are on that is that essentially the Three Waters reforms, we have several issues with. There's sort of 3 really. The first is that there's no real scale benefits, and the actual investments needed I think are quite unrealistic, and a lot of councils have been saying that they really have gone through the numbers and said that's a real challenge. The second problem is that you end up with what we call cross-subsidisation. So, the 5 district councils are 5 of about 20 or 22, I think, that are in the entity. It could well be run by Palmerston North or somewhere else in the country, and they as a result, you end up subsidising someone who's got bad water assets from someone who's got good water assets. So it's what we call cross-subsidisation. But the biggest issue is really the loss of governance and management of these water entities. So at today, a ratepayer is represented by councils who actually manage those assets on their behalf. And by and large, up and down the country, they do a pretty good job of dealing with water management. But fundamentally, the proposed structure means that the government, the local government, and certainly the local people are going to lose their ability to influence those big mega entities that the government's looking to create. So our situation is, look, we acknowledge over the next 30 years there will be some real investment needed and some challenges that need to be addressed across New Zealand in managing the 3 waters, which is wastewater, storm water, drinking water. But the problem is not the same everywhere, and therefore one size doesn't fit all. So if you think about it, here in the Hawke's Bay region, in Havelock North, you manage, with Havelock North, Flaxmere and the surrounding areas, you manage to fix your water problems for about $80 million, and now you have a really good set of standards and systems in place. But importantly, the same people that were dealing with that issue have actually come together and said, hey, listen, over the next 30 years, the long term, we think there is a different way of doing this, and it's actually about the assets staying in local control, but us working together in what we call a council-controlled organisation. And I think that's the model that is so much better, because it will be so much more responsive to the local communities and the needs of the local community here than what we're seeing by running a big super bureaucracy and mega entity from somewhere else in the country that really isn't connected to Havelock as a result. So so I mean, we think there's a really good need for us to continue to invest. It shouldn't be one size fits all. We support this creation of a national water regulator which sets the standards for drinking water and enforces those standards. And then finally, we think the solution is what we're seeing here in the Hawke's Bay and being proposed by your leaders here. And I think they really are at the vanguard and the forefront of the thinking in this space.
Because sort of going on from what you're saying, like taking away control from the councils, like what does it leave councils to do really?
That's the big problem, and that's another piece of work around really the future of local government. And if you believe that everything should be centralised and controlled and run out of Wellington, that's a lot of what this government has been all about. If you think about the initial COVID response, it was all to be run through Wellington, not using communities or local organisations on the ground where those communities are. We've seen the same thing happen with polytechnics. It's all been merged into one. We're seeing it now happen with district health boards being subsumed into one big mega entity called Health New Zealand. And we're seeing it here with 67 councils' assets being taken from them and put into 4 big mega entities as well. So, that's the real question, is do you believe in a country that should be centralised and controlled with 100% of things coming from Wellington with big bureaucracies? Or do you actually trust people in local communities to know what they need for their particular community? And we in the National Party are on that side of saying, look, we want to see stronger local government and localism happening in our communities, because we think that people closest to the problems or the opportunities are the best people to solve them. And so that's the real tension. Now, the challenge with all of that is also the way we've been running local government across New Zealand has been the same since the 1970s, 1980s, and arguably there's a different way of doing that, I think, where in many ways if you're sitting in local government, you end up incurring a lot of the costs of growth and development, because if you're going to open up a new housing subdivision, you've got to make sure the water pipes go in, the roads go in, all the services go in, and you have to make those investments before you even get the rates back from members, from ratepayers or residents that are going to move into that area. If you're central government, you get a lot of tax benefits from all of that. And so there's just some questions about, is there not a better way of doing things going forward, where we actually have local and central government working together in partnership, not in a parent-child relationship, but in an adult-to-adult one, where they are jointly unified on delivering things that will matter the most to those communities that they're representing. And so here in the Hawke's Bay, we know we've got some really big challenges on transport, right? We know we've got some big challenges around hospital. We know we've got some big challenges around law and order. And as you mentioned, skill shortages as well. They're probably the big 4 as I sort of listen to people today.
Okay, and then sort of pivoting, last election, a lot of the national seats, particularly in Hawke's Bay, Tukituki and Wairarapa were lost. How do you see going forward? What's your strategy to win those back?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, that's really partly why I'm here, because, the reality is that, we had a very poor election result in 2020. The New Zealand people lost trust and confidence in the National Party for very good reasons in some cases. We were, not at our best, I would say to you, in the last 2 or 3 years. And really that's what the events before Christmas and the transition to me as the new leader has all been about, which is saying, hey, listen, we're turning the page, we're focusing on the New Zealand people, we want to oppose the government, but we also importantly want to propose ideas of how we would take this country forward and to be able to discuss and debate those and present those to the New Zealand people as well. And so that's a really important thing, that we're able to do both those pieces. If we can do that, then we earn back the trust and confidence to be a mainstream political party again, where we can attract 1 and 2 voters that are walking up and down the street. And so, yes, these are historically, seats that have been very strong for the National Party, but we need to be able to come here and demonstrate that we're serious about listening to the concerns of the people here, and then developing plans so that they can actually build trust that we will actually follow through and do what we say we will do when we become government again in 2023. So it's a poor election result. There's a lot of work for us to do, but we've made a really good, positive and encouraging start.
And just finally, will National be contesting the Ikaroa Rafidi seat?
That's something that we'll work through in the coming months, but that is something that we really need to do. If we're going to be a very successful mainstream party, we have to be a national party. And what I mean by that is that we have to be able to present our beliefs and our principles and our plans and our proposals to each and every community across New Zealand. And so whether it's Māori, whether it's New Zealand communities, we want to be everywhere, being able to present the case for why we think our government would be good for those communities. And so, but that's the work that we've got to do in the next 6 months.